Enosis. You stand on the bridge of a Japanese cruiser at midnight near the Solomon Islands. Around you, absolute silence, broken only by the rustle of waves against the hull and the quiet creak of rigging. Stars twinkle in the black skies of Bimsa, but there is no moon. Perfect conditions for a night ambush. You are a master of darkness. Years of training, thousands of night exercises, binoculars with 7 times light amplification, perfectly calibrated to your eye. You know in the dark you're stronger. The enemy is blind and you're sharper than a blade. But at this very moment, as you believe you control the space, the first explosion rings out. No warning, no flash on the horizon, a direct hit to the hull in the engine room area. The ship shudders like a wounded animal. You see no fire, no muzzle flash, no silhouettes. You're already under attack, and you don't understand from where. Because 22 kilometers away in complete darkness, a radar operator aboard an American destroyer has just provided targeting data for artillery, without leaving his stuffy radar room, without looking through binoculars, without seeing the ocean. Imagine you are the best night sailor in the world. You have light amplifying binoculars that no one else possesses. Your crew has trained for years, practicing salvos in complete darkness against silhouettes barely visible against the stars. You are confident that night is your ally. But in the very first minutes of battle, you lose 70% of your combat effectiveness. Why? Because your enemy doesn't need light. He doesn't look through binoculars. He doesn't wait for the flash of your shot. He already sees you. 22 kilometers away in absolute darkness through fog and rain, your advantage has become a trap. The better you were at seeing in the dark, the blinder you became to someone who saw without eyes. As US Navy combat reports later documented, Japanese ships, deprived of visual contact, often fired at false targets, or remained silent until they were shot down by the unseen. By the end of this story, you will understand how an invisible radio signal, reflected from a steel hull in the ocean, destroyed a centuries-old doctrine of naval warfare. You will learn how a simple flickering green screen in a cramped destroyer's radar room replaced hundreds of hours of training, how a technology that the Japanese Naval Command considered secondary and cut funding for its development turned night into day and stripped Japan of its most formidable weapon. This is not just a story about radar. It is a story about how confidence in one's superiority can become the last mistake, and how a single green pulse on a screen can decide the fate of a fleet. In the 1930s, Japanese sailors trained as if daylight didn't exist. Imagine Kura Naval Base. Crews go to sea at night, first under a full moon, then in moonless, inky darkness. They learn to listen to the ocean, to identify the type of ship by the sound of its propellers. A 3-bladed destroyer hummed differently than a 4-bladed cruiser. They learn to see the invisible, the gleam of foam on the stern, a barely perceptible silhouette against the stars. Gunners spent hours practicing salvos at targets they couldn't see. Coordinates were whispered to them by observers from the highest masts. The task was 1, how to kill the enemy before he fired first. The answer was a doctrine of night combat, perfected to a fanatical degree. By 1941, the Japanese fleet was conducting night fire with an accuracy of 50 meters at a range of 10 kilometers. It was a record unattainable by anyone else. This entire system rested on 3 pillars: speed, accuracy, and visual contact. Ships were specially modified for night attacks. Superstructures were reduced to lower the silhouette. Powerful searchlights were installed, but only for the final deadly blow. Artillery was equipped with the best optics in the world, and each observer received personal binoculars with immense light-gathering power, capable of detecting the light of a single match from several kilometers away. The Japanese were years ahead of the West in this technology. All their tactics were built on one simple idea: the enemy would inevitably reveal themselves. By a muzzle flash, by a fire on deck, by a silhouette on the horizon. One only needed to wait for this mistake, deliver a massive strike, and withdraw before a response. The system worked, flawlessly, as long as the enemy played by the rules. And here's where it gets strange. The best night shooters in the world, capable of hitting a needle from 10 kilometers, increasingly fired into emptiness. Why? Because American destroyers learned to break the game. They didn't turn on lights. They didn't fire first. They didn't expose themselves to attack. They simply waited, in complete darkness, with their SG radar on, scanning the space 200 times a minute. The Japanese, accustomed to night always revealing the enemy, became blind. Their system, built on perfect human vision, simply collapsed before an opponent who refused to be seen. As one Japanese officer later wrote in his memoirs, "We searched for shadows and echoes killed us. Darkness was their ally, their weapon, their god. But everything crumbled when someone appeared who could see in it without eyes. Someone who needed neither binoculars, nor moonlight, nor the flashes of your shots. Someone who turned night into day with radio waves." This technology was not born in the roar of naval battles. It was born in the quiet laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and initially, even its creators didn't understand what they had wrought. Americans too initially distrusted radar, but unlike the Japanese, they very quickly learned to trust not their eyes, but the green screen. But this trust wasn't immediate. In 1940, engineers installed a strange contraption aboard the heavy cruiser USS Northampton, a metal grid on the mast and a box of tubes in a stuffy radar room. Officers viewed it as a trick. How could a piece of iron see a ship in the dark? Operators sat for hours in front of a screen where a green dot flickered, trying to explain to the gunners, "The ship is there 2 degrees to the left at 15 kilometers, but they weren't believed. Until one day, during exercises near Pearl Harbor, the radar detected a target behind a dense layer of clouds, and the artillery hit the target without seeing it. At that moment, the question changed. Not how to make metal see, but how to make humans trust what they don't see. The SG radar, which by 1942 was on almost every American destroyer, worked on a simple but utterly alien principle for humans. Imagine it shouts into the darkness with a radio pulse and listens for the echo. This shout, a short pulse at 3 gigahertz, reflects off anything metallic and returns. By the time this echo returns, which is only 15,000ths of a second for 22 kilometers, it calculates the distance. By the angle of the antenna that caught the echo, it determines the direction. And it doesn't care about light, about fog, about a storm. The signal went directly to the fire control room, where an electromechanical brain, the Mark 1A computer, calculated the trajectory of the salvo, accounting for target speed, wind, and roll. It was electronic vision. Cold, precise, emotionless. And it never blinked. Now, imagine yourself. You are destroying a ship without going on deck. You sit in a cramped, stuffy radar room, wearing headphones in front of a flickering green screen. You don't see the ocean, don't feel the salty wind, don't hear shouts. You just see a flash on the oscilloscope, and you give the command, "Fire." A minute later, you are told by phone, "Target destroyed." This was a new war. Abstract, remote, devoid of heroism, but terrifyingly effective. Man was no longer the eye of the fleet. The instrument was, and the operator became a translator, from the language of the machine to the language of artillery. The technology was ready, radars worked, but the tactics did not. American commanders didn't know how to use this new vision. They doubted, ignored, waited for visual confirmation, and this almost cost them the entire fleet. Because in August 1942, off Cape Savo, the radars were silent. Not because they didn't see, but because they weren't believed. Operators reported Japanese ships, but commanders demanded to see with their own eyes. This delay in trusting the machine proved fatal, and it was the last bloody chance for the Japanese doctrine. The night of August 9th, the strait off Savo Island. Imagine you're aboard an American cruiser, at anchor, guarding a landing. Calm, weariness, complete certainty that the enemy is far away. But in the SG radar room on the cruiser USS Chicago, the operator sees dots, a group of ships, speed 27 knots, bearing 350, distance 18 kilometers. He reports again and again, but the commander waits for visual confirmation. Minutes crawl by. The green flashes on the screen grow closer, and in response, silence. Then, a blinding light. Not on the screen, in reality. Japanese salvos tear through the darkness. The cruisers Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes burn. They sink. In half an hour, the Americans lose 4 ships and over 1,000 sailors. All this time, the radars screamed about the threat, but no one believed them. And here's the mind trap. The failure at Savo was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of tactics and psychology. The radars worked perfectly, but they weren't integrated into the system. The operator's report didn't go directly to the gunners, but to a duty officer who looked into the darkness and saw nothing. And if the eye doesn't see, then it doesn't exist. Does that feeling sound familiar? When intuition screams one thing and your eyes say another. Whom do you trust? Commanders considered. Radar a toy, an auxiliary device. They demanded confirmation from an observer with binoculars, and the Japanese were sailing without lights. There was nothing to confirm, till steel began tearing steel. It's like giving a soldier an automatic rifle but not teaching him to aim. US Navy reports would later call this a collapse of trust in the machine. And now the most terrifying part. The radar saw the Japanese squadron 20 minutes before the first salvo. 20 minutes. In naval combat, that's an eternity. Enough time to raise anchors, turn guns, call for air support. But the report drowned in doubt. Perhaps it's interference, or clouds, said the communications officer. And they waited, until their ships turned into flaming coffins. The very human factor that the Japanese revered became the Americans' Achilles' heel. The irony is that the US had the chance to correct the mistake. Japan did not, because their culture believed in spirit and skill, not in soulless machines. Technology without tactics is just expensive scrap metal. This defeat became a lesson, harsh, bloody, but necessary. Because after Savo, the US Navy did what the Japanese could not. They changed not their equipment, but their mindset. They created a combat cycle of radar, computer, gun, excluding the human with his doubts. They taught commanders to trust the signal more than their own eyes. And it was this trust, born in fire and humiliation, that transformed the night from a Japanese ally into an American firing range. November 1942, imagine you're on the bridge of the destroyer USS Duncan. Around you, the inky darkness off Vella Island. Your captain, Frederick Moosebrugger, remembers Savo. He remembers the burning cruisers and the cries of friends in the water. He made a decision. No more doubts. If the radar says target, then there is a target. And we fire, without visual contact, without a single glance through binoculars. At 1:12 a.m, the operator in the stuffy radar room reports over headphones. Contact, bearing 285, distance 17 kilometers, speed 20 knots. Moosebrugger doesn't hesitate for a second. His voice cuts through the silence. Target, cruiser, open fire. This new tactic was not improvisation. It was a conveyor belt of death, finely tuned to the millisecond. Radar sees the target. Data flies to the central artillery plotting room. The Mark 1A electromechanical brain instantly calculates the target's course, speed, and intercept point. The guns turn by themselves, guided by an invisible hand. Salvo. All this takes 90 seconds. 90 seconds from a flash on the screen to steel flying towards the target. Man no longer aims, he simply translates the language of the machine into the language of artillery. And here's the result. Duncan's very first shells tear apart the bridge of the Japanese cruiser Furutaka. Admiral Aritomo Goto, one of the best masters of night combat, dies instantly. He never saw a single American ship. By 1943, 92% of American destroyers and cruisers in the Pacific had SG or SC radars. Think about that number. 92%. This wasn't just a technical rearmament, it was a complete shift in the philosophy of war. In 1 year, the fleet went from humiliating distrust to total reliance on electronic vision. And what about the Japanese? Less than 15% of their ships had radars, and those were outdated Type 21 models, with a detection range of less than 10 kilometers and no integration into fire control systems. But even their commanders didn't use them. They continued to believe in spirit, in sharp eyesight, in binoculars. The gap wasn't in technology, it became a cultural chasm, and it was deadly. Now, the night belonged to those who didn't need the moon, to those who didn't search for silhouettes on the horizon, but read coordinates on a screen. And this new, terrifying reality was about to crash down on the Japanese fleet with all its might. Because Admiral Goto, dying on his bridge, might have only thought one thing. From where? How did they see us? The answer wasn't in the stars, it was in the radio waves that reflected off his own ship and returned to the killer as the echo of his own death. November 1942. The Pacific Ocean. Darkness isn't just the absence of light. It's a dense, almost physical substance that suffocates sounds. Admiral Aritomo Goto stands on the bridge of the cruiser Aoba. His squadron is heading for Vella Island. Mission: bombard the Americans and disappear before dawn. His men are elite. They can see the silhouette of a destroyer 5 kilometers away by the reflection of the waves. They fire without seeing the target. intuition, honed by thousands of night exercises. But tonight, something is wrong. Imagine the feeling. You sense the enemy with your skin. The damp air has grown heavy. The officer's breathing is ragged. He's nearby. But where? Goto strains his binoculars. Only black water. Silence. And suddenly, flashes. Not from the flank, not from the front, directly ahead. Salvos, precise as a surgeon's incision, tear through the night from 12 kilometers. It's beyond visual range. His ship is already burning, and he still doesn't see the enemy. His last thought, how did they find us? And here's how. This victory was not accidental. It was the first naval battle in history won solely by radar data. Aboard the American destroyer, the operator sits in a stuffy ozone-scented radar room. He doesn't see the ocean, doesn't feel the wind. He looks at a green screen. He sees a flash. He relays coordinates over headphones to the gunners. Fire, without any visual contact. This was a new kind of battle. Imagine you're playing chess. You're a grandmaster. You know all the moves, and your opponent suddenly pulls out a pistol and shoots your queen across the board. Japanese tactics, built on speed and maneuver, became useless, because the opponent was no longer playing chess. He had turned a duel of masters into an asymmetric operation to destroy the invisible. Admiral Goto died in the first minutes. He was shot from emptiness. He never saw the ships that killed him. This was not just a defeat, it was the destruction of confidence itself. According to Japanese combat reports, after this battle, darkness became a prison for them for the first time. Their eyes, their world-class binoculars, their training, all of it turned to rubbish in the face of electronic vision that doesn't blink and doesn't tire. And here's the most chilling part. Japanese ships, designed for night salvos, in 70% of cases fired at empty space. Their detection system waited for a muzzle flash, but the radar-equipped enemy simply didn't fire until they were certain of a hit. They hunted shadows and echoes shot them. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution, carried out by an invisible executioner. The Battle of Vella proved technology broke the rules, and those who believed in old doctrines condemned themselves to death. But why didn't the Japanese fleet change? Why, after such a catastrophe, did they continue to train observers, not radar operators? The answer lies not in tactics. It's in the soul of their military culture. For a Japanese officer, radar was not a weapon. It was a betrayal. A betrayal of the warrior ideal, whose skill is born of sweat and discipline, not radio tubes and wires. They chose faith in man over faith in machine, and that faith killed them. And now imagine, 1943. The Pacific Ocean. Japanese sailors still go to sea at night. They still practice salvos at imaginary targets, standing at their guns with eyes closed to feel the ship's movement. They still believe their eyes are the best radar. But now, every sortie is a game of Russian roulette with a fully loaded chamber. American destroyers no longer wait. SG radar sees their low-profile silhouettes at 15 kilometers and destroys them before they can even get close. One by one, Japanese crews perish without even seeing the enemy. Their ships settle on the floor of the Pacific, like ghosts disappearing into the darkness they once considered their own. The cold, silent water swallows the last cries and the last belief that man can defeat the machine. The collapse of this doctrine was inevitable. And here's why. By 1943, less than 15% of Japanese ships had any radar at all. Most of them were outdated Type 21 models with a 1.5 meter wavelength, easily jammed by interference and sea swell. But even those commanders barely used, due to lack of training, due to a deep distrust of electronic devices that lie. At the same time, 92% of American destroyers and cruisers in the Pacific carried SG or SC radars on their masts. But the issue wasn't the technology. The Japanese leadership believed that human skill was superior to any machine. They invested resources in training, not technology. Their blindness was not physical, it was ideological. And now for the most striking detail. The Japanese leadership didn't just ignore radars. They deliberately cut funding for radar programs in M41 and 1942. The money was redirected to training camps and night exercises. Instead of developing electronic vision, they doubled down on eye training. They believed, if a sailor is well trained enough, he will defeat any machine. This confidence proved fatal, because war doesn't wait for you to understand that the rules have changed. It simply destroys those who play by the old ones. Japanese officers' memoirs confirm, even after the Battle of Vella, Many commanders considered the defeat an accident, not a signal for change. Mastery did not die from stupidity. It died from faith in its own invincibility, from the conviction that if you are the best at what you do, the world around you will never change. But the world changed. It became invisible. Now victory went not to those who saw best in the dark, but to those who didn't need light at all. And this change forever altered the very nature of naval warfare. It transformed it from an art into a science, from intuition into calculation. October 1944, Leyte Gulf. The Japanese fleet makes a last desperate attempt. They go again at night, again hoping for speed, for manoeuvre, for that very night magic that once worked at Savo. But now the Americans aren't just waiting. They see them from 50 miles away. Radars on destroyers, cruisers, and PBY Catalina patrol aircraft created a continuous field, and they destroy them before the Japanese ships can even approach the target. There is no battle, no clash, only radio messages about the demise of squadrons that never even saw the enemy. The night they called their weapon became their grave. The water, black and merciless, swallows the last cruiser, and the last hope. Radar changed not just tactics, it changed strategy. Previously, sea control meant winning battles. Now control became a matter of detection range. Imagine radars on ships, planes, and coastal stations create an invisible dome under which an enemy cannot pass unnoticed. The Americans shifted from reaction to dominance. They no longer waited for an attack, they prevented it. This was a transition from combat to spatial control. According to the Naval War College, by the end of 1944, the average time of detection of a Japanese fleet before battle was 38 minutes. An eternity to strike and withdraw. And now imagine, modern Aegis destroyers see targets at a distance of 400 kilometers. Night as a concept has disappeared. Darkness no longer conceals. War doesn't depend on weather, time of day, or keen eyesight. It depends on algorithms, satellites, and data processing speed. What began with a simple SG radar on a mast, with a 3x2 meter mattress-shaped antenna, transformed into a global system. In it, man is no longer the eye. He is an operator in front of a screen where artificial intelligence predicts trajectories, and this evolution began precisely on that night off Vella Island, when one admiral did not see his killer, and ushered in the era of invisible war. Now war is waged not by eyes, but by algorithms, not by intuition, but by data, not by mastery in darkness, but by precision at a distance. And this change is not merely military, it is philosophical, because it forces us to ask, what does it mean to see, and what does it mean to be seen? The answer to this question determines not only the outcome of battle, but the very nature of future conflicts, where the line between man and machine blurs, and victory goes to whoever first learns to trust the invisible. Radar became a bridge between three forces that decide war, skill, technology, and the ability to change. The Japanese staked everything on the first, rejected the second, and failed the third. The Americans? They initially failed too. Remember Savo? Radars screamed, but commanders trusted their eyes. But they learned. They integrated the machine into tactics, and tactics into strategy. Their victory is not just a triumph of iron, it is a victory of a flexible mind. As Admiral Chester Nimitz later wrote in an analytical report, "We did not win the war with radars, we won it by letting radars teach us." And here is the final image of this story. Two men, one stands on the bridge, clutches binoculars, peers into the black water, searching for an enemy that is no longer there. The other sits in a stuffy radar room, in headphones, looks at a flickering screen where each green pulse is the fate of a ship. Admiral Goto and the nameless radar operator. Master and machine, past and future. One died without ever understanding what happened. The other survived without ever seeing the face of the one he killed. Their encounter on that night off Vella is not just a battle. It is the end of an era where war depended on the human eye. But the most terrifying blindness is not when you cannot see the enemy. The most terrifying blindness is when you are absolutely certain that you see everything. When you believe so strongly in your skill, in your training, in your traditions, that you simply stop noticing how the world around you has changed. The Japanese fleet did not perish because of bad ships. It perished because it stopped looking. And he who stops looking is destined to be seen first, and destroyed without warning. archaeologists who investigated sunken Japanese cruisers off Vella found something strange. Type 21 radar antennas on the masts were often removed before battle. Why? To avoid obstructing the view. Imagine, they removed electronic eyes to see better with their own. This is not just a technical detail, it is a verdict. And now a question for you. What is more important in war, the honed skill of a human or the cold precision of a machine? Choose one side and explain to yourself why. Because this choice, it's not about the past, it's about the future, about whom we will trust to decide who lives and who dies. A man with binoculars, or an algorithm in a black box. And remember, in Neo 42, the Japanese were also absolutely sure of their answer.